Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the July 21st edition of CropTalk. And the year seems to be flying by here. We're getting to the end of July, and I've been talking to a few people, and I think when we get to the western side of the province here, we're going to start seeing some next week to 10 days. We might even see some peas being sprayed, and definitely some fall rye that is starting to turn fairly good as well. So harvest isn't that far away. But for this week, we're going to look at something a little bit different than crops. We're going to look at some of the plants to watch out for as we're in a situation of dry conditions in a lot of areas. And was talking with Kim Brown and thought it'd be a good idea if we maybe went through some of the plants to watch for in sloughs, non-traditional haylands, ditches, just to help identify some of them. We're getting some calls from some producers as to, is this a dangerous plant or is this not a dangerous plant? And so I thought it'd be good, and Kim thought it would be a good idea to talk about it as well. Then we're going to go into our crop scouting panel, and we're going to deal with some issues as well with the dry conditions and then some of the things that are popping up in the fields as we go forward closer to harvest. So I guess with that, we'll start with Kim. So Laurie, if you could turn the screen over to Kim, we'll start with her presentation.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. Can you guys see my screen?
You bet.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so today I'm probably just going to talk about what I've just titled Undesirables in Hay, because I know this is when we're out making hay and looking for alternative places to make hay. So we're talking ditches, possibly some sloughs and things like that, maybe some areas that we haven't been able to get into in the wetter years, or just taking hay off land that we maybe haven't before just because we're in a hay shortage. So there's other plants too that we could talk about that are more pasture plants, and sometimes there's sometimes some overlap, but there are some weeds in pastures, or I guess undesirable plants in pastures that sometimes when our pastures run out, that animals wouldn't normally eat, and they would end up eating some of the things that they wouldn't normally go to, just because of palatability and things like that, but that can cause some problems. But that's a bit of a different talk, so maybe we could talk about that some other time. We can see what the state of the pastures are like. So this is really just a few pictures and stuff. More weeds I'd like you to be watching for in hay, especially. And so going forward, oops. Burdock, this is one up north. We have woolly burdock. Down south, it's just regular burdock. This is one that we see a lot in waste areas, old yard sites, can creep into our fields as well. But we do see this in the ditches sometimes, and it does have some different qualities. So in addition to the burrs themselves, and anytime there's a burr on a plant, normally that's a plant that we don't want to be putting into our hay. Burrs are adapted to get transported by animals or on clothing and that type of thing, and so normally they'll have some type of a prickle or awns, or not really awns, but prickles that will stick to animals' fur and to our clothing and that type of thing. And so normally those can cause irritation when they get stuck inside an animal's mouth, and they can cause irritation in the digestive tract. They also can cause irritation around the nose and the eyes when if the animal was grazing this, or while they're eating it from hay. So I've got a few plants in here, and there's obviously others that I don't have in that have awns or have burrs, and those are things that in general we just want to try to avoid. Sometimes there might not be a feed issue with it, but it's more that physical issue of having that burr. But there are some toxic compounds as well in burdock, both the woolly burdock and the regular common burdock. So that is something that I would be trying to stay away from. And Lionel, a lot of these pictures are from Lionel, so thank you, Lionel. We've got pictures in our slide deck, but these are ones that Lionel took for me just yesterday. So these are weeds that are out there. And Lionel, if you want to jump in at any point, just please just, you know, if you've got, you know, if you'd say where this is from or whether you've seen lots of this in certain areas, I think whatever, if you want to jump in, please, by all means. Going forward, this one is just goldenrod, and there's a few different kinds of goldenrod. This is probably the most common one. There's another one here, this next picture. I think this is just a different type of goldenrod. These actually have some forage value. There is sap in them, and lots of times, anytime there is sap in a plant, that we want to try to avoid that if possible. When an animal is grazing this, then there can be some irritation in the mouth coming from the sap if it gets in the eyes, that type of thing. I think there is a moderate feed value with goldenrod. There's nothing terribly poisonous about it. But again, because any of these plants that have sap, we really don't want them in our hay unless we absolutely can't avoid them. But this is not one of the really bad ones, but it still is something, again, between this picture, this goldenrod, which is a bigger plant, and has a kind of a bigger leaf. These ones tend to get a bit taller. Sometimes too with goldenrods about this time of year, you start to see these big balls on the stem, and there's galls, and I think it's a little wasp that lays eggs in there. And so you can identify them too if you're not sure what plant it is. Sometimes they have this big ball in the stem, and if you cut it open, there's actually a larvae inside. But anyways, that's a telltale sign that that's a goldenrod. So again, avoid them if you can. Not extremely toxic, but still, because of that sap, we'd like to try to avoid it. Leafy Spurge, here's one that we don't want to see. Unfortunately, it is spreading all through Manitoba. Southern Manitoba is full of this. We've got it down here in Carmen. It's spreading up north as well. We're seeing it move on the highways. Highway 10, Highway 20 going north of Dauphin is starting to see quite a bit of this. And I think it's getting almost up to Swan River now. So we see this. It does have, because of the sap, actually the sap in this is quite toxic to animals. Normally cattle would avoid it in a pasture. They might eat it when it's very small, but normally they wouldn't. Sheep and goats will eat this and can tolerate a fair amount of this, but in a hay, they wouldn't be able to, most animals wouldn't be able to pick this out. And because of that sap, those qualities are in there. So as hay, and another thing too is when you are buying hay from other areas, really watch where you're getting this from, because a lot of these weeds are extremely, we don't want them in our areas. If you don't have leafy spurge where you are right now, you don't want it, and you have to be really careful bringing in hay that might have leafy spurge or something like red bartzia. That's another one. I don't have a picture of that. It's not really toxic, but it is very invasive. So those are, and I know we have some of that in the Dauphin and Gilbert Plains area that had come in some hay that had been bought probably 20 years ago during a drought situation. And so it's there, and you know, not really spreading too much. They're keeping it under control, but it's definitely affecting the fields that it's in. So leafy spurge is one that is, again, extremely invasive because of that sap. We've got some toxic properties. We want to avoid that in our hay, and in the pastures, the animals will self-avoid. They will, they won't eat that unless they absolutely have to. Thistles in general, this is a picture that Lionel had sent, and so sometimes right about this time of year, it's maybe a touch early, but we are starting to see some of this. We see this white top on thistles. It's a fungus. I think it's Foma Macrostoma. It's actually a natural biological control. It's obviously not enough to control our thistles completely because we have lots of Canada thistle elsewhere, but it does infect members of that family. So it has, you know, there's been attempts in the past to try to use things like this for biological control. They do work somewhat. It will take a population down, but there will be thistles present. But that picture, this picture here, just of Canada thistle, and then this next picture, here's another thistle. We've got several thistle varieties in Manitoba. There's bull thistle, there's nodding thistle, there's wavy leaf thistle. There's quite a few, and even some of them are native, and most of them are introduced. They can be quite aggressive in our pastures when they get into our pastures. So again, we need to be careful bringing in hay from other places. Because you can be bringing in the seed, and a lot of these thistles are very, very prickly. Something like a sow thistle, really, that's not a prickly thistle, but some of these other thistles have a lot of prickles in them, so it causes a lot of physical discomfort when the animal is eating. Sometimes some of these prickles will fall off a little bit when the plant wilts down when you're making hay, but most of the time they don't. And so you end up still having this in the hay, and so it's a physical irritant when the animal's eating. So you want to avoid hay with any kind of thistles in it at all, because that's really hard on animals. This is something that is extremely toxic. This is probably what's the most toxic plant, most poisonous plant in agriculture that we deal with, and this is water hemlock. There's a few plants in this family. I'm going to show you some pictures. There's a few that really look alike, and but they're in the what we call the Apiaceae family, or used to be called Umbelliferae. And this top here, if you can see me circling with my mouse, they call this an umbel, and basically all the flowers are kind of at the very top of the stems, and they're in this almost like an umbrella type shape, and that's called an umbel type of in plant botany terms. And so a lot of these plants that I'm going to show you have that shape. Basically anything with that type of a flower top, avoid. It might not be water hemlock. I'm going to show you how to tell what water hemlock is, but I really don't want you touching water hemlock. It's extremely poisonous. All parts of the plant are poisonous, but the root is very, very poisonous. One bite of a root, or even one bite of the plant, depending on the stage, can kill a cow. So handling this plant, you need to be very, very careful. Wear gloves, not leather gloves, because the toxins can absorb into leather. Same as herbicides. You don't handle, you don't mix herbicides with leather gloves. You use plastic gloves so that you don't get absorption. And anyway, so this is water hemlock. The leaves here are a little bit wider. This next picture I've got, actually Lionel took this picture, and these leaves here on this, again, very similar flower type, this umbel at the top. These are white flower clusters, but the leaves here are a lot finer. It's a little hard to see because it's in the grass. Also too, you would see water hemlock in water. It's water hemlock is usually where it's very, very wet, whereas water parsnip, which is what this is more kind of on the edges of the sloughs, and where you've got a little bit more ground, obviously, and we've got some grasses or some reeds or some sedges or something growing here. So we're not really in standing water or on the edge of standing water like we would see with the water hemlock. But again, this plant is a water parsnip, again, because of this leaf is a little bit more finely divided. And it is still poisonous, not as poisonous as water hemlock, but just avoid it. If you do not want your animals anywhere near this, they would self-avoid. These plants are very bitter tasting. They shouldn't be voluntarily consuming these unless they were absolutely had nothing else to consume. But normally they would avoid these plants. But you do see these, and this another one I've got here in a minute. We do see wild parsnip, which is another one again, and there are some toxic properties. So anything you have that umbel type flower, whether it's yellow or white, you need to avoid those. Don't put those in your hay. You probably wouldn't get the water parsnip and the water hemlock in your hay because they're just too wet areas. You wouldn't be haying in there, but you could see it in pastures as well. But anyways, here's to tell the difference between the water hemlock and the water parsnip. This one is they're both perennials. This one has more tubers. They kind of look like a Jerusalem artichoke root, whereas these roots are more fibrous. These leaves are though much bigger, and these leaves here are much narrower and much finer, but the flower top is almost identical. So if you see that flower top, you would be avoiding it. And then one thing, a dead giveaway here, is these tuberous roots. When you cut them open, again, be very careful handling this plant. This is water hemlock. They have these channels, these pith channels that run horizontally through the root. And so that is a dead giveaway that's water hemlock. And this is the most poisonous part of the plant here. So be extremely careful. These tubers, again, one bite of this will kill a cow. And sometimes too, when you open this up, there's a sap that oozes out. Again, very toxic, very poisonous. Be very careful with this plant. This next one is actually wild parsnip, different than water parsnip. It grows more in hay areas where you might be taking some native hay or some wild hay. It's got a leaf much more like a celery type thing, and it's a yellow flower. But again, it's got that umbrella shaped top, or here you can kind of see these flowers on this one are yellow, and this one is mildly toxic. There are some toxic properties to it, so I would be avoiding it as well. It's not nearly as poisonous as the water parsnip or the water hemlock, but very poisonous. And just looking at this picture in the background, I had been called out to southeast Manitoba, looking at some tier 1 noxious weeds, in particular orange hawkweed, and we were at a field that was full of a number of different weeds, tier 1, tier 2 weeds, lots of oxeye daisy, some plants like this, lots of different plants. And an enterprising farmer had been haying this land and selling it and called it Ukrainian hay. And I had never heard that term before, not really sure what that meant, but apparently he was able to get quite a premium because he was selling it based on the fact that it was full of what he called wildflowers, and it was very good because it was had a lot of different plants in it. Unfortunately, a lot of them were weeds, and I'm not sure it shouldn't. Anyways, it was kind of funny that farmer is no longer selling that hay because it is full of weeds, and some of them are tier 1 weeds, so that is absolutely not allowed. But you do need to be careful getting hay from other sources. And again, I had never heard that term before, but I just thought it was interesting. But it was definitely a lot of different species. I would have said, based on the species in this hay crop, that it looked very similar to this in the background, lots of different colors, lots of different plants in there, but I think the nutritional value was probably very low, although the farmer was able to get $100 a bale, so I guess good for him, but you do need to be really careful where this hay is coming from because you don't know what's in there. This is a picture that Lionel had sent yesterday. This is just wild bergamot. It's like a wildflower. The bees love it. Very nice plant. You see this in a lot of wildflower gardens and things like that. We do see it wild. So it can grow both in the wetter areas. It can be in the drier areas too. You tend not to see it out on the really, really dry areas. So you'd see it on field edges and again, maybe slough edges and stuff. It actually is edible in some ways. The leaves can be a substitute for oregano. They're very, very strongly flavored and very strongly scented too. So sometimes in hay, you have to be careful with these plants. In something like a dairy quality hay, you wouldn't want any of these plants that have these strong odors or strong tastes in them because that can get into the milk. For most of us that are beef cattle producers, we're not as concerned about that. But again, you might see this and it's kind of got a really showy top on it, usually purpley colored or pinky colored, kind of a big top. But again, these leaves, they're opposite. It's in the mint family, so square stem. And if you pull these leaves off, they're very strongly scented and they smell very much like oregano, but not poisonous at all. But again, it does have very strong odors and flavors. So it would, there could be a taint to it. This is wild licorice, not really much of an issue poison-wise. Although it does have a very strong flavor. Actually, the root on this is what used to be dug up and used for licorice flavoring, but it does have burrs. Once these flower heads are finished flowering and the burrs form, so you will see a lot of burrs. So anytime, again, there's a burr, we've got some irritation in the animal's mouth, possibly in the eyes if they're, if they're putting their head down into this when they're grazing, or even in hay, they just can get into the nose and the eyes and that when they're sticking their head in a bale as well. So whether you're bale feeding or rolling out the bales or shredding or whatever, that depends. But anytime we have a burr, we want to watch. This is a native plant, so it's not something I'm too worried about spreading. But again, I don't think there's a lot of feed value in this, and that's maybe something that Sean or Lionel could speak to more about feed value of some of these native plants. But again, you do have to watch the burrs in this one. And again, it would be very strongly scented, but again, more of the flavoring on this one, or more of that actually came from the root part of this plant. It was gathered at one point for the licorice flavor. This is milkweed. Lots of milkweed around this year. Some of these are big plants. They have opposite leaves, a big leaf on them. Whenever you pull any of these leaves off, a white sap will come out. So there is some toxic properties. A lot of these plants that have sap will have some toxic properties to them, and so we do need to be careful. A lot of milkweed in the ditches. It regrows really fast too, so sometimes our ditches were mowed and this will grow back really quickly, so be really careful too you when you've got this one. This is common milkweed, but there's a few other species. Some of them are a bit smaller, but in general, we do have to watch just the toxicity, mostly because of the sap here. It can cause irritants, skin irritants, and again, so irritants in the mouth, on the animals, nose and eyes, and that type of thing. And again, just really no feed value in this whatsoever. So that can be confused and is quite often confused with hemp dog vein. This is tends to be a smaller plant. I guess it can be quite tall, but the leaves tend to be a bit smaller. They are opposite as well. The stems on this are kind of reddish colored, whereas some of the milkweed stems are quite reddish colored as well. Kind of smaller flowers, similar flower type, I guess, on the ends of the branches, and that so it's got what we call terminal inflorescence. But this one has some toxic properties as well. It gets confused with milkweed quite often, but neither of them should be in your hay or in the pastures. The animals will avoid them. If you pull these leaves off, a white sap will come out, and again, there are issues with the sap and some toxic properties in that sap. So I have seen a lot of hemp dog vein around this year in places that I haven't normally seen it, and I'm not sure why that is, but I would be careful. Again, in a pasture situation, your animals really should be avoiding this, because any saps tend to be bitter, and animals will avoid those plants unless there's absolutely nothing else to eat. And so if we do start getting very short on pasture, I think then that's something that we have to be aware of, is the plants that are in our pasture that we want to try to keep the animals away from. But for hay, I'm hoping this isn't, I tend not to see this in the ditches, like in the wide open. It does tend to be a bit more where there's a bit of shelter in the bush, or maybe smaller pastures. It does tend to kind of creep in and stuff. So just kind of watch that coming in from the bush line if you're taking hay off some of these pastures that have, trees around the edge of them type thing. Seaside Aerograss is one. I know there has been poisonings of this in southern Manitoba. I don't know of any lately, but I know they have been documented cases. Horses seem to be really affected by this. The top part of this plant kind of looks like the top of a plantain, if you know what that is, kind of this long top. And this plant is quite poisonous, and it does seem to affect horses, and it tends to be more in pastures and more in drier areas as well. But we do have this in southern Manitoba, so it is something to be avoiding. I don't think we have it much up north past #1 highway. I haven't seen any reports of it, but again, the poisonings, there has been some documented poisonings in southwestern Manitoba in the past, so it is something to be watching for. Again, hopefully more so in a pasture than in a hay situation, but again, just keep your eye out for that. And that was all I had. I just wanted to mention there is lots of kind of regular weeds that we can take for hay. Again, kochia, there are things that we have to watch out for. There's lots of these weeds tend to accumulate nitrates. Something like kochia has nitrates in it. It has oxalates as well. That's actually quite common in a lot of weeds. Even something like a stinkweed, there are toxins in the pods of stinkweed, so that is something to be avoiding in hay. But quite a few of our regular weeds that we would see in our crops and maybe on our field edges, we do have to avoid those. I think we all know what those look like, so I haven't talked about them here too much. But again, it's something to be aware of if you're starting to take hay from areas that you just don't normally take hay from, and there's not a lot of traditional hay plants where you're cutting. Be really careful with even more of our common weeds like our kochia, our Russian thistle, any of those. Lamb's quarters can really accumulate nitrates as well. And like I said, even something like stinkweed, which we see at a lot of field edges and that type of thing, once it's got pods on it, you should be avoiding that. But if there's any questions, or if you have any pictures, if you see some weeds and you're not sure what they are, Lionel's pretty good at weed ID. Actually, Lionel's very good at weed ID, but you can send them to me as well. So Lionel and I would look at pictures. You can text them to me. That's easy enough. And yeah, just send me, if you've got a plant that you're not sure what it is, then you could send that and we could identify it for you and kind of let you know whether it's got toxic properties or not. And I think that's all I've got for now.
Good. Well, that's good. We got some questions for you, so I'll start off with them for you. Question came in: do we have giant hogweed in Manitoba?
No, we don't. It gets confused with cow parsnip a lot. They are quite similar. Giant hogweed is much bigger. It can get to like 8 feet tall. There's a few differing characteristics in it. We have an article somewhere as I could make available, but we do not have giant hogweed that I know of. We get calls on it every year, but every time we get a call that somebody thinks it's giant hogweed, it ends up being cow parsnip. They have a similar flower like the water hemlock and the water parsnip, and they have a very similar type flower, but they're a big leaf on them. And both the cow parsnip and the giant hogweed are big plants. But like I said, to my knowledge, we do not have the hogweed. It's more of an Ontario issue and into the States as well. But I would suspect if you think you've got it, send pictures. But again, I would be 99.9% sure that it's cow parsnip that we're talking about.
Okay. The next question is, I guess it's got a, I should read it again here, but basically what it's asking is, it's asking if, should we be watching where we're buying green feed, especially in areas where we have weed resistance. You kind of touched on that a bit. I guess my concern with that question might be some of the newer ones that were showing resistance, and should we be concerned about spreading that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that we do need to be concerned with. I would be more concerned if we're buying dry hay, because by the time we're doing dry hay, well, now I guess you know, if lots of times the weeds in there have gone to seed, or there's lots of plants that are heading out. In our field crops right now, if you're cutting for green feed, a lot of our weeds do have seeds on them, or the seed heads are there. I think a lot of our weed seeds are not mature yet. So I think when we're looking at a green feed situation, because it is a little earlier in the year, and a lot of those weeds that are in those crops, they tend to hold onto their seed a little bit longer. So again, I think that we do have to be very careful. I think right now there's not a lot out there that has gone to seed. Well, something like a downy brome, a Japanese brome are different. They go to seed very early. Those are the cheat grasses, because they go to seed. They can be fully headed out and viable seed at 6 weeks after emergence. But most of our weeds that would be in our crops that we're taking for green feed, I'm hoping that they're not viable yet, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And yeah, we do have to watch. I've seen some new water hemp infestations, and there is just starting to be seed heads on that. So those aren't viable yet, but I would say in a couple of weeks, we'd have to be careful. Wild oats are heading out, but the seeds on wild oats have to be fairly, like, really mature. So even moving something around that has wild oats in it, if those seeds aren't mature, they shouldn't be able to germinate and cause issues. But we don't want to be taking, the minute we get later and later in the year and we start moving feed around, is when we start seeing weed seeds get moved around as well.
Okay, those were the two that have came in right now, but you're going to stay on because I think I might have a question later on here as well. So
sure.
Good. Okay, thanks, Kim. That was some good information, and something where we don't normally talk about it on a normal year, but it's good to get an update on some of those weeds just so we can kind of keep them in our head as we drive around and are cutting some hay. So thanks for doing that. So we're going to go to our crop scouting panel, and we have a new panel member on today. Sean Kaybeck from our forage and livestock team is going to be on, and we have a couple questions for him. First question, and I think he was able to prepare a few slides. I was given this question during the week. I was at a producer's place that was putting up some hay, and his sloughs around had a lot of issues with algae on them. So I gave Sean a call, and he was able to put some stuff together for us. So Lori, if we can pass the screen over to Sean, and we'll kind of go from there.
Good morning.
Hi, Sean.
I'll just bring up my presentation here.
You bet.
How's that?
We're just a little bit, oh, there we go, perfect, yeah.
Okay, good. So with the dry conditions this year, lack of rainfall, lack of runoff, we're starting to see some water quality and quantity issues. So when we look at water requirements of cattle on pasture, they require sufficient quantities and sufficient quality to achieve optimal performance for health and growth. So when we look at an average cow-calf pair, this will vary a little bit depending on calf and cow size, but they require around that 15 gallons of good quality water per day. Hotter weather, larger animals will require a little bit more. So if you're not sure of your water supplies, if they will last the summer, on Alberta Ag's website, there's a really good calculator on determining how much water is in your dugout. And when we're starting to get to lower levels, there is definite concern whether it will last the summer. Even if you have grass, will you have enough water? So when we're getting to lower water quantities in our dugouts, and especially when we have direct access, blue-green algae is a possibility. And that's one of the most concerning algae when it comes to water quality, because they can produce a toxin that's harmful to people, pets, and livestock. So they can form floating clumps or scums on the water surface. So it can look like a thick pea soup or paint, have an unpleasant odor. And if you look at it really closely, it looks like small grass clippings in the water. Just having trouble advancing the slides. Here we go. So if you're not familiar with blue-green algae, you can send in a water sample to Prairie Diagnostic Services, and they will test it for the microcystines and other toxins. The cost is $113, and you need to send in the sample frozen and on ice. So in this kind of hot weather, it's a little difficult to get it there in a frozen state, but they suggest to ship it frozen and on ice. And it's a fairly quick turnaround of a couple days to get the test done. So just a little bit on dugout maintenance and treatment. So one way of keeping algae out is keeping the nutrients out of your dugout or your water source. And if you don't have an adequate buffer or vegetative area to filter the nutrients, to filter the water, that's when the nutrients can get into your water source. And one of the main ways of keeping nutrients out is keeping the livestock out of your water source. So if you haven't set up an alternative watering system, such as solar or wind or a pipeline, then that's something that you should consider. And especially when the water levels are low in those dugouts and the cattle are going in, they're not only affecting water quality, but they're pushing the sides of the dugout in, and then your longevity of your dugout is not as long as it should be, and then you're having to clean it out. So you don't want to treat your water source if algae are not visible. You want to make sure that it is algae that you are treating. We often have what we call duckweed. It looks like a miniature four-leaf clover that floats on the surface. This is actually beneficial because it helps shade the water and prevent algae from growing. So if it's only duckweed that you have, you don't have to worry about treating the water. Bluestone is one of the old standard treatments that producers have used for years. You don't need a lot of bluestone to treat the dugout for algae. If it's a 250,000 gallon dugout, which is kind of an average size, you only need 1.25 pounds. If it's a little larger dugout, 360,000 gallons, you only need 1.75 pounds of bluestone. And that dugout is 200 by 70 by 10 feet deep. You can apply your bluestone, either put it in a porous bag like a burlap or a pillowcase and tie on some baler twine, and you can drag it through the dugout all directions until the bluestone is totally dissolved, or you can dissolve it in a backpack sprayer and then walk around the edges and spray it onto the dugout. Another method of treatment is diquat, used to be called Reglone, and it's more for the weeds that are growing in the dugout, such as cattails and other types of pond weeds that you might have in there. After you treat the dugout, you want to remove the livestock for at least 10 days to 2 weeks, because when you kill off the algae, they release a toxin, and that is what is deadly. And when we hear of some of the issues with livestock dying from drinking different water sources, the algae may have been killed off by extreme heat, release toxins, cattle drink the water, and then we see the cattle deaths. Some of you may recall a couple years ago where in southwest Saskatchewan, there was 200 cattle died from a water source. That wasn't from algae, it was from extreme sulfates and total dissolved solid levels. And the sulfates were 3 times the lethal limit, and the total dissolved solids were 7 times the level that livestock should not drink. So not only do we have to be worried about our algae levels, but other minerals and salts and sulfates and solids. So you can send in a water sample for a regular water test to central testing in Winnipeg, and anyone who's concerned with their water quality should look at carrying this out. And just wanted to mention the BMP 503 program, which is available for producers who want to clean out a dugout, who want to construct new dugouts, they want to put in a new well for their pasture watering system. There is funding available. It's up to $10,000 at 50%. And one of the catches with the program is if it's for a surface water system, such as a dugout, you need to fence it off and put in either a solar, wind, or pipeline system and restrict the livestock access to the dugout, because that enhances water quality and longevity of the dugout. Your dugout will last longer, and better quality water, livestock performance is that much better too. So the deadline to apply is September 1st. Any expenses that have already incurred are still eligible, and it's retroactive to April 1st. So definitely consider applying. The applications are on Manitoba Agriculture's website, so you can check it out there or contact one of our offices for more information. And that's all I had, Lionel.
Hey, one question that came in was, you mentioned taking the cattle off. So was that for bluestone as well? They need to move the cattle out for a period of time after treatment?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, I kind of thought that's what you meant there, but yeah, no, good. Okay, that's it for right now, but could I get you to hold on? There might be a question coming up for you a little bit later here as well.
Sure thing.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.
Lori, if you could hand the screen back to me. Okay, next question is to John Gavlowski. Producer sent me this one. He was looking for grasshoppers in his field, and he's seen these markings on the leaves throughout the crop, and you can actually see them even in the background there. What's causing that on the, he didn't think it was grasshoppers. He's wondering what's causing that.
Yeah, that's definitely not grasshoppers. That's probably, there's a couple options. There's an insect called a bill bug, which is a type of weevil that will sometimes poke holes in leaves when they're still curled up. And the other insect that can do that is stink bugs. And we have seen a fair number of stink bugs around. Generally not considered an economic issue, but they will create sometimes rows of holes as well, much because of the same feeding pattern as the weevil. The difference is with the stink bugs, eventually you often get a yellow halo around the holes. So if it's rows of white holes like that and they start getting yellow halos, is probably stink bugs, and that's because of their saliva. And if without the yellow halo, I would say probably bill bug.
Okay, and what sometimes happens with that too is those those leaves will tear easier that way, right?
They can, yes, that's right. They can get torn or shredded a bit easier.
Okay. Another question while we're talking about this, and this one, I forgot to put a slide together, but while I still have you on, producer sent me, there was a hailstorm that went through here a few days ago, but the producer sent me a picture. He was out in his field looking at his canola, and he had some pods that were curled right up, like almost like a slinky kind of curled to them. What's causing that?
The insect that causes that is called thrips, and there's a few different types of thrips. They're very tiny insects with hairy wings, but you'd have to look under a magnifier to probably see the hairy wings. What they often do is feed specifically on the upper surface of the pod, and so the pod is growing unevenly, and that causes the pod to curl. It almost looks like a curly fry, the end result. Owen Olfert in Saskatoon did some research to try to figure out, is thrip feeding economical in canola? And he did a few different studies on this and concluded that although highly visible, it's not economical. So now I guess there can always be exceptions, but generally speaking, it's very visible but not highly economical.
Yeah, because sometimes even some producers will think it might be chemical injury from what they sprayed and stuff, but more than likely that's a thrip, right?
More likely, yes. I know there's other causes for it, but often it is thrip related.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Okay, Kim kind of mentioned this a bit, but if John Hurd, if you're on, or if you're not, I'm going to get Kim to answer this again. But John, if you're on, can you tell us what's happening to this thistle plant?
I think we'll have to go to Kim.
Okay, Kim, you mentioned a bit about this, but you were kind of brief, and we're just wondering. We're seeing lots of that in the ditches and even in some of the fields where the white tops on the thistles. Could you kind of go into that again for us?
Yeah, that's a fungal disease called Foma Macrostoma, if I'm saying that right. And it does affect thistles. It's a form of biological control, like a natural control. It can take down whole populations in an area. In general, though, it's not enough to obviously wipe out Canada thistle, because we have huge problems with Canada thistle in some fields. And also it starts to show up about this time of the year. So the problem with some of our biocontrol, we've had in the past, there was some biocontrol products for things like ground leaf mallow. The problem is they usually tend to show up a bit later in the year, about now or from now through till August. So a lot of the problems, like the crop competition, it's occurred long ago. These thistles have already affected our yield type thing. They've taken valuable nutrients, valuable moisture, especially this year. Taking the moisture was a big deal. So these natural biocontrol systems do show up, but they tend to show up quite late in the year, and they're really not terribly useful for us in crop. I think there's been a number of attempts to commercialize some of these. To my knowledge, there isn't anything available. And again, if there was, it does tend to take all season to get to this point where these thistles are not producing any fluff. A lot of these thistles do end up dying, but again, it does occur a little bit later in the year. So it's a fungal disease, and you can get a whole patch where every thistle in the patch is affected and they will die. Unfortunately, though, it's not enough to kill out the entire species.
Good, thanks, Kim. For Dave Kaminsky or Ann, I guess producer sent me this one 2 days ago. He hadn't sprayed for Fusarium in his barley. Wanted to know if that was Fusarium, and also he was wanting to know the barley is completely headed and starting to fill is it worthwhile, or does he need to go in with the rescue spray?
Thanks, Lionel. Yes, that picture definitely illustrates Fusarium infected kernels in barley. And we have now surveyed a total of 6 fields. They were all 2-row barley. This is probably a higher level of infection than we've seen in those, but generally the infection level is extremely low. That is, we're finding at the most 7 or 8 heads out of 100 that have any Fusarium, and most times it's just a single spikelet. So that's not going to be an issue and end up in harvested grain as any kind of visibly damaged kernel. There won't be a significant level of toxin. And any spraying that you do at this point is not a rescue treatment, but a revenge treatment. It's a waste of time and money. And if you've already sprayed at an earlier timing for flag leaf disease control, you're just running the risk of resistance development by repeated use of a fungicide in the crop.
Okay, and the second question he has is, would those kernels that are infected spread up and down in the head, or is that the only infection he's going to see in that head?
If you have wet conditions after this, very wet, or just continuing high humidity or fog, you might see some fungal growth coming from those spikelets and covering part of the head, but that will not result in infected kernels. It's superficial, and the kernels can only get infected at the time of anthesis or flowering.
Okay, great. That's kind of what he was looking to hear, I think. So thanks, David.
Okay, yep.
Another one for you, David, before you go too far. There was some hail in the area, and producers that didn't get really bad hail, like the picture on the right-hand side, are seeing some of their canola crops like this. And there's been always talk in the past of would a fungicide be of any benefit to helping this canola get through the next couple of weeks and back to good regrowth stages?
The later damage is that image on the left, I think. On the right,
yeah.
You've got pretty severe damage.
Yeah.
So the one disease that can be associated with hail damage is blackleg. However, most of the varieties that we have out there are now quite highly resistant to blackleg. And again, I don't think that blackleg could do much in terms of real damage to the crop, yield limiting damage. It only does that when it's affecting the stems lower down. So that would have occurred or have had to occurred at the rosette stage. Again, using a fungicide in this case is not going to be useful. I guess if it stayed wet again, sclerotinia is a slight possibility, but again, that's only going to happen in the upper part of the canopy and won't be yield limiting. You just got to take your lumps. Sorry for the bad pun there, but we've got crop insurance. That's the way to go to determine what the potential yield loss is, and it probably won't be a wonderful crop. So you need the economics in order to justify a fungicide spray. And I would say 99 times out of 100, that's not the case here. You won't get any money back from a fungicide.
Okay, good. Thanks, David. While I'm on this slide, Sean, the question came up was, could I go in and silage this canola if I get a good enough hail insurance claim and still make some value out of the canola. Any experience, or do you have any comments regarding making silage out of canola?
Yeah, it's not a common crop that's used for silage or for livestock feed, so there hasn't been a lot of feed tests on it. It is reasonably good quality, so from a quality perspective, energy in the mid to high 50s, protein can be in the low to mid teens, so good feed quality. One of the concerns for putting it up as silage is getting it dried down to the desired moisture levels. And if it's baled silage, you want to be in around 45 to 55% moisture. If it's chopped silage, then you're looking at that 60 to 65% moisture. So pretty good quality. When you're short of feed, producers are going to be considering all kinds of different forages. So definitely something worth considering. Being stressed by hail, nitrates are a possibility. So any of the annuals this year, I would suggest producers to look at testing their annual crops for nitrates that have been stressed, whether it's hit by hail or whether it's drought stress.
Yeah, and if I could add one comment, just a little bit from experience, if you're going to wrap the bales, especially if you're going to wrap them in a row, that the moisture content changes from bale to bale. So it's really hard to get that good average moisture. So if you were going to do it, probably a pile would probably be better than wrapping in a row at least. I'm not sure about wrapping individual bales, but I know the row can be kind of challenging. John Hurd isn't on, but maybe I could get Marla to maybe talk about this, something that's going to be happening in the next little while here.
I would love to talk about it if I knew more about it, but this is also kind of new to me. So yes, as with last year.
I on Twitter this morning, so I figured I better put it up. So.
No, it's a good thing to put up. So if anyone had attended last year, there was a field tour for the 4-hour nutrient management kind of program, with Mario Tenuta having kind of hosted it. It was near Carmen, and it was a self-guided tour. So in this case now, looks like it's a very similar idea. They may be staggering groups as noted here because of COVID restrictions. So hopefully they'll actually be a little less self-guided and actually be able to put groups through, which it looks like they are planning to do. So again, it's at, I'm not exactly sure where this field is going to be. But this field tour, they're going to be talking about a lot of the different nitrogen management projects that are going on within Mario's research program.
Okay, thanks, Marla. This slide here, basically to let everybody know about the BMP that Sean talked about. Been getting some calls about it the last few days here, so the contact people are Andrea and Colleen, and if you're interested in the program, especially if you need to update your environmental farm plan, get a hold of these people. Like Sean mentioned, a lot of the expenses will be retroactive to April, so you're still eligible to get assistance, especially if you're in need of water, and there's a lot of areas where this is starting to become an issue. There's your ag adaptation specialist. So the 6 of us throughout the province. If you got questions, please feel free to contact them. I also included this week our forage production extension specialists for livestock. So you have Pam, Tim, Elizabeth, Sean, and Marnie. So there's their contact information or the phone numbers. So if you need to, or you want to talk to somebody regarding some of the livestock issues, I'm sure these people would be able to help you with any of your questions. Our MASC offices. So there's the crop insurance offices and their toll-free numbers. So if you're in a situation where you're wanting somebody to come out and adjust your field, especially if you're looking at doing something for green feed, contact these offices, let them know what you're planning on doing. And if This way they'll be able to come out and give you the steps required for before you take it for green feed. There's the 21800 numbers, one for Manitoba Ag and one for MASC. Again, you can contact these lines and they can get to help you get in contact with people you might need. There's our hay listing website. So if you're looking for hay, or if you got hay you want to put up for sale, go to that website. Or if you want help in putting stuff up, or actually if you want to put stuff up, best to call the Manitoba Ag toll-free number. And I don't see any more questions, so that will conclude everything for this week. And join us next week, July 28th, where we'll be seeing a lot of crop ripening in and maybe some pre-harvest being started. So thanks for attending, and thanks for our panelists.